Hello, hello. My name is Hannah and I am here to wrap up my reading for 2024. I'm not gonna lie to you, I think this specific video is my least favourite one to make. I nearly didn't make it. And it's because well, we'll get into why it's hard. But I'm sure you can imagine why it's hard. I don't want to commit to my best books, but nevertheless, I'm gonna try. So in this video, we're gonna run through some stats, things I noticed in my reading. Gonna put some graphs and charts up on the screen. I track my reading using Storygraph, but I also have a separate spreadsheet that has some other bits and bobs of information in, so I will be talking you through some of that. Then I am going to be talking to you about my best books of the year. I'm anxious about it. Isn't that so fucking dumb? But nevertheless. So we're going to do best books, and then at the end, I'm going to quickly wrap up the books that I read in December, because I never know where a December wrap up fits. In that, you know, like, I feel like if you create content around reading, or kind of anything, I guess, really, like at the end of the year, people will do their like wrap ups. But obviously I do on this channel a monthly, most of the time I do a monthly reading wrap up. And I never know when to put December's, because I feel like if I did it like now at the end of December, well actually we're into January really, aren't we? Like before I did the reading wrap, like no one's interested in just what I read in December. Like everyone wants the same sort of content at this time of year. They want to know wrap ups, they want to know stats, they want to know plans for next year. So I feel like you can't do it first, but then like you kind of can't do it last, but then I feel bad because I read some great books in December. So if you can be fucking arsed and I don't end up waffling on for ages, try and stick around to the end, because I really had a lovely reading time in December and I would like to tell you about the books that I read. So that is this video. Next week's video, I'm going to be reviewing my goals for 2024 and whether I achieved them or not, and talking goals, intentions, plans for 2025. So that is next week. This is the stats, it's the best books, it's a December wrap up. Okay? Get a drink. I have things to say. So we're going to start with some straight up numbers. I read 153 books this year. I don't really the numbers, the totals, it's not really what I'm into. I'm surprised it's that high. It is about average for me, or at least about average for me, since I really started reading again as an adult in my like late 20s was probably when I properly started getting back into reading. But it's about normal for me. That is not me implying that should be the normal amount that you read. However much you read, that's the right amount. But I'm kind of like, whatever, it's 153 books, I don't really care. This is a kind of genre breakdown. And by genre, in this instance, I mean like fiction, non-fiction, poetry, short stories, etc. So this is that. So we are looking, I have copious notes down here. So if I'm looking down, yes, I am looking at notes. Forgive me for not knowing this off the top of my fucking head. So we are mostly looking at novels. Unsurprising, 76% of my reading is novels, and I am a little sad about that. I have read some really good non-fiction this year. I really wish I'd read a little bit more poetry. I was supposed to read more poetry this year, and I enjoyed the poetry I read. I'm still in the process of trying to cultivate that as a habit. 1 second. I'm gonna turn a light on, because I have a light, but I still feel like I'm a glowing white face. I'm turning a light on. Okay, sorry to anyone who is now getting like big light phobia through the screen. What was I saying? Yeah, I wanted to read more poetry this year, but I'm still not in the habit of doing that so much. So I'm not thrilled with how this pie chart looks, is what I'm telling you. According to Storygraph, these are the genres that I read the most of this year. It's not overly surprising. Literary, I would be so interested if there is ever a year where literary is not my top genre. But historical, being kind of neck and neck with queer, is interesting to me. We're going to talk about some historical fiction, spoiler, later on in the video. I've had a lovely time with historical fiction this year. I always forget how much I like it. And I really, again, spoiler for next week's video, I would really like to read more historical fiction. Because I really, normally, I think for the last couple of years, my top 3 genres by quite a way have always been literary, contemporary, queer. So to see historical kind of like really rise through the ranks there, I'm interested, and mystery too. But this was the year that I read a lot more crime adjacent books. So there we go. Some other little stats, don't have graphs for these, but 22 of the books that I read this year were debuts. So that's about 14% of my reading. And I like that. What I don't track, and I think I might track next year, is tracking when it's a new to me author, because I feel like I haven't done a very good job this year of returning to authors that I really like or have liked in the past. So I'm surprised that the debut number isn't higher, but then I think I've just been reading a lot of authors for the first time this year, but not going like right the way back to the beginning of their back catalogue, which makes sense. The average year of publication for the books that I read this year is 2012, which I'm kind of surprised at. I'm definitely not someone who like is always like right up to the minute with my reading. I read predominantly backlist books because I'm cheap. But I did think this might be lower, and I realized there was one thing that I couldn't make my spreadsheet do, and it's because I read The Odyssey this year, which is like way, way, way old, like BC, and I don't know how to do BC in an average calculation. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like a minus number. Anyway, it should be a fair bit earlier than 2012, but I don't really know. I haven't tracked that year on year enough to know if like I'm comfortable with that as a number. This is more of just like a benchmark stat for me to keep an eye on in the future. Indie publishers, which is a famously difficult thing to like track, because sometimes you think you found an indie and then you find out that they're actually an imprint of a much larger publishing organization. And I don't think I have tracked this like perfectly this year, but I think ballpark, I think I've read 56 books this year from independent publishers, which I am counting as basically not any of the really big publishers or any of their imprints. Now, some of them have brilliant kind of artisanal, highly curated, very cool, very indie feeling imprints. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying we shouldn't read them. I just personally, I've only really properly in the last couple of years, pretty much since I started making content, started looking at the publishers of the books that I read, because before I would really just be going off of like the author. So that would mean that if it was an author that I really liked, you tend to stick in that publisher because authors tend to stick with their publisher. So yeah, I I'm kind of pleased with that, but like, no one interrogate the data on that one because I could be wrong. I think the Euros reading challenge that I did this year really helped out with that, because I was looking for very specific books from a number of different European countries that I just couldn't get my hands on from the big publishers in the UK. So that actually really helped me out. Then acquisition. So this is like where the books came from that I read this year. And I'm going to put this pie chart on the screen now, which looks a little intense. Feel free to pause the video here and screenshot it, because it's not going to be on the screen for very long. But this is kind of all of the different ways that I read books. So I read a few books on Audible. I don't have an active Audible subscription anymore, but I had a few still in my library that I hadn't read. Then BorrowBox, which is the app that my libraries that I'm a member of use. I know lots of people use Libby, but my libraries use BorrowBox. And then various kind of other little categories. This is a more simplified version of it. So this one, you can see that on the whole, the majority, there's two big chunks there, and that is physical books from my TBR, from this shelf here, which is a bookcase pretty much exclusively of unread books. So from there, good, great. That was 27% of my reading. I mean, could be higher, but 27% books I already owned. Then exactly the same percentage, Everand. Now I'm pleased with that, because if I'm going to pay a monthly subscription, and something like Everand, which has like no cap on the number of like pieces, like the number of books you can read a month, unlike Audible or Libro FM or Zigzag, I think is another one, where you get like a certain amount of credits a month and you spend that credit on buying an audiobook. Everand is kind of more like a paid for library, where you have an account, and once you have an account, you can read anything there. They do have certain like annoying things where they like lock certain titles for the next month to make sure you roll the membership over, but on the whole, I make really good use of that, and I personally, for the amount that I use it, definitely feel like I'm getting my money's worth. So I want to keep that number at around like 25 to 30%, because then I know it's like worth keeping the subscription. If that was a drop to like 5 or 10% because I was reading in other ways, I would probably have to pause my subscription, because like otherwise, what am I doing, you know? So they're the big chunks. Then if you combine those two green ones there at the top and the bottom, that's physical books that I got out from the library, and books that I got out from the library via BorrowBox, which is 26% of my reading. So almost as much of my reading from my shelves has been from the library this year, which I am so happy about. I'm really, really glad that I have got much better at supporting my local libraries, and I feel like my libraries are getting better at stocking the sorts of things that I want to read. When I first went into my local library that's like at the end of my street, there's like some interesting stuff in there, but like not a lot of like literary fiction, like my sort of bag. And I think they've like noticed that I'm coming and using the library quite a lot, and they are getting more and more titles, and I've been talking to people and it's been lovely. So loving that. Then the blue one at the top, that bigger chunk, that's 12% from other subscriptions, so not my Everand subscription, and that's basically Audible, like ones that I listen to from Audible and ones that I listen to on Libro FM, because I swapped from Audible to Libro FM this year, which I'm really pleased to have done. Although I did have to I had to reopen my Audible account for 1 month in order to get Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. And the main reason I did that instead of Libro FM was because it's such a short audiobook that I didn't want to spend a credit, like a whole credit on it. And Audible had like begged me to come back and gave me like a free credit. So I was like, fine, I will come back and I will use a free credit on this short audiobook that I don't want to buy in any other format. So, and then the other two, there's a tiny little sliver at the top for NetGalley. I read 2 NetGalley books this year, so like really not very many at all. And I can't remember what the second one was. One was definitely Hours. The other one I read is gone. And then what I have called the bookish ecosystem. So as opposed to books that are on my shelf that at some point I bought for myself or were gifted to me, I call the bookish ecosystem just sometimes like books that just came into my life. Like a friend was like, do you want this? Or like, I think you should read this book. Like Lens, things like that, book swaps. And that was 7% of my reading. So that's where the books have come from. Format-wise, very much entering my audio era. I have listened to audiobooks for probably like the last 5 or 6 years. But really this year was the year that I thought I started really understanding what I like in an audiobook and what I will and won't listen to on audio, like the genres that I think work really well, the things that I like and the things that I don't like. So 39% of my reading was audio this year and only 45% was physical. Now I know it's still more physical books than audiobooks, but I think I didn't do a comparison with last year, but I think that's higher. And I'm also reading more digital books than I have ever read before. And that I think is a mixture of Everand and library, borrow box. And I at the moment read on a tablet, so it's not the best screen for like reading a lot on. So I'm thinking of getting a proper e-reader next year. I would like to get a Kobo. But if you have strong opinions on e-readers, if you mostly read on an e-reader, I would love to know your thoughts down below. I'm desperate not to get a Kindle. But I mean, if you have to advocate for a Kindle down below, feel free, try and change my mind. But yeah, I'm thinking Kobo. Let me know your thoughts. Then country. So this is, again, it's not a perfect system because you have, you know, people who have like dual nationalities or, you know, might have been born in a country but then like raised in another country, and which country do you stick them in? So this isn't perfect, okay? But I read from 35 different countries this year, which I'm really pleased with, but was definitely really brought up by the Euros reading challenge that I did this year, where I read a book from 24 different European countries, the countries that were competing in the men's Euros football competition. The video is linked down below if you want to know what the fuck that was all about. So I've read from a lot of countries, but mostly European countries. So I got some work to do next year, but that's good. It's good to know these things. So 57 of the books were from England, 44 were from the USA, and then the numbers drop right down. So we've got then 8 from Ireland, 4 from Scotland, 3 from the Netherlands, 3 from Japan, 2 from Spain, 2 from Turkey, 2 from Germany, 2 from Australia, 2 from Wales, and just 1 book from all of the rest of the countries on the screen. Kind of like it could be worse. It could be from way fewer countries, but no Northern Ireland, because I split my read. I split it into the 4 nations of the United Kingdom because I used to track it as like British, and then had a sneaking suspicion it would mostly be English with a bit of Scottish, and lo and behold, last year I don't think I read any Welsh books or Northern Irish books. This year, just no Northern Irish books. So I'll do something about that. But you know, those are the countries. I can't change them now. Then final few little bits of stats. I read 30 books by global majority authors this year. I haven't mathsed that. What's that, like a fifth? I again, not bad, could be better. Then 24 books were translated, which I'm surprised at. That must mean that a lot of the books I read for the Euros were written in English, or I just didn't read any other translated books, but I definitely did. So I don't think that number's right, but 24 apparently. And 51 were queer in some way, which is about a third of the books. Although, like, mostly they were, I think, women loving women, generally. No, is that true? Probably not true. I would like any trans non-binary recs in the comments down below. I would also like any literary fiction dealing with ace and aro identities. Do we have such a thing? Does such a book exist? I would like to read it if it does. So that is books. Is that all I have to say about books? What have I written here? Oh no, I have a little bit more. I only did this about half an hour ago and I've already forgotten. It bodes well for the wrap up, eh? What have I got here? Got a bit of first and last. The first book I read this year was The Call by Edith Etten Zangwill. And the last book I read this year was Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. So bookending with some, with a classic and then some historical fiction. Nice. The longest book I read this year was The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber, which was, it was over 860 pages, I think. The shortest was So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan, which I think was about 40 pages, tiny little novella. But the average length was around 300 pages, 311 to be exact. So then in terms of like the reading rhythm for the year, I think those of you who have not just stumbled across my channel here and who've been here for the last few months will know that I have had a patchy reading year. So this is my flow for the year. I think this happens every year. Not that giant slump in October. Like September, October was bad news bears time. It was not good for the reading. I think I totally burnt myself out on a few different things, which I'll be talking about in next week's video. But I always start kind of like solidly in January, but slightly overdo it. I always have a little dip off in February, but it is a shorter month. Then I maintain for a really long time. And then at some point in the year, I go fucking nuts. Normally, I think it's the summer holidays. And in my head, I think like the school holidays, even though I'm not actually off in the school holidays. I do work in education and it is like a quieter time for me, but I'm still working. But in my head, I think, well, I must have to read 20 books that month because I'm off, it's the summer. And I think that I then like go too hard and then it makes the start of autumn really weird and annoying. So we had an almighty slump in October this year, which is why I think I'm surprised that I still ended up reading so many books this year, because that's basically September was and then October was like nothing. So yeah, interesting. But here you can see a kind of slightly different view. I track the number of days it takes me to read a book because I'm a like multi-book at a time reader. I normally have around 4 books on the go. I like to have at least 1 audiobook. Sometimes I have 2 audiobooks, like a fiction and a non-fiction, or like an audiobook that's got really short chapters and an audiobook that's got really long chapters. And then I'll have like normally a physical book and then sometimes an ebook, or I'll have like a novel and a non-fiction or like whatever. So like I like to have a little mixture around. And for that reason, even though I read quite a lot, you'd think I would be reading like 3 books a week and churning them out quite quickly if I'm averaging 150 books in a year. But that's not the case. It takes me around 7 days to read a book. So like one book a week, but obviously my average comes out at more than that. But it takes me around a week to read a book. And I quite like that because I don't love to blast through books really, really quickly, although we will be talking about some that I did. I quite like spending time with books. So this graph shows like the average days it took me to finish the books that I read in the month that I read them. So you can see it's like reasonably stable. And then in April, there's like it started taking me a little bit longer. I think I read some longer books around then. And I think I was a bit busier, like more things going on. So like I just wasn't picking my books up as much. And then in October, like it goes up to like, it was taking me 12 days to finish a book. But that's actually because it took me like so long to read one of the books. And then I only read one other book. So I averaged at 12. But yeah, that's how long things took me to read. Then what are we doing next? This is like a fun little mystery to me. Oh no, okay, fuck. Okay, that's it for stats. That's it for stats, everyone. Stretch your legs, stretch your arms, stretch your spirit. Okay, my best books of the year. I hate this. I hate this so much. I am a person that values freedom and choice above almost everything. So I hate being pinned down. I hate being forced to commit to things. I like everything to be free and open, always. It's why, despite me and my partner being together for 13 years, we're still not married, because I'm like, no, freedom, always. I want to be able to walk out tomorrow. I'm a keeper. But like, it's important to me. I wish it wasn't. It's not a conscious thing. It's just I start to, when I feel like my choices are being limited, I get real grumpy. And I feel a little bit like that about having to commit to these were my best books of the year. Not because I think I have really changeable feelings about the books, but I am very aware that my opinions on things do shift and change a lot over time. That's not a special me thing. That's just human beings, and we don't stay the same forever thing. And so I'm really conscious that like once I say these are the 10 best books I read this year, like that fixes it then. So I need you to know that I'm gonna tell you my 10 best books this year. I've even rank ordered them. We're gonna go 10 up to 1. But just know that this is a snapshot in time. This is how I feel on this day. And the books might not change wildly over time, but they'd change a bit. The order would change. A couple might drop down and a couple might go up. But I did this quite quickly, because I knew that if I agonized over it, I was never gonna get a list of 10 books in an order that I was 100% convinced I would never change my mind on. So I was like, well, why go to the effort of really thinking about it then? We'll just vibe it. Which is the reason that I made this video at the halfway point of the year. I did a video where I wanted to talk about the best books that I'd read so far that year, but for all of the same reasons that I've just talked at length about then, I couldn't bring myself to sit down and make a list. So instead I did like a live tier ranking thing. Not live, but you know, like it was a surprise to me where I was going to put things. I hadn't pre-planned where things were going to go. Of the best books that I read this year. And so when it came to doing this section of this video, I went and looked at what books had I included in June as the best books that I had read in June, and therefore what books do I need to add into that to make my best books of the year list. And it has changed wildly. It's so interesting. So in reverse order, this is the June books. This is how I felt about the books that I'd read up until the end of June. My top 10 that I had when I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, translated from the French by Ros Schwartz, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, Blackouts by Justin Torres, Tom Lake by Anne Patchett, A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood, Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Mandy Mortimer, Boulder by Ava Baltazar, Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter, and at this time in June, the best book I'd read this year was The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. I had some honourable mentions, which I may as well say now. The Book of Strange New Things by Michelle Faber, Poor Things by Alistair Gray, Companion Piece by Ali Smith, The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, The Birthday Party by Lauren Mauvignier, translated from the French by Daniel Levin Becker, Pity by Andrew Macmillan, and Private Rights by Julia Armfield. Now, I stand by all of those books as great books, but what has been, I'm so glad I made that video, because I have been shocked by how much some things have moved around. So only, how many? Only 3 of those books from that top 10 are in my top 10 for the year. Now, that's not on the whole super surprising. Obviously, the books that I read in the second half of the year are a little fresher in my head. In fact, 3 of them are books that I read in December, but I am confident that they are my best books of the year. I don't think I've got proximity bias too badly with it. But what's interesting about the 3 that have stayed in is that they're not necessarily the top 3 books. So a lot of the books, particularly the newer releases that I read, have fallen out of that top 10. And I'm just so interested in myself. I find myself fascinating, interesting. Yeah, so I've been interested in this process now. Okay, here we go. In the number 10 position, and the only book to hold its place, is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, which was number 10 halfway through the year and is still my number 10. And I think it's my number 10 because I can't bring myself to drop it out of my number 10. Because I think it's a really special book. I think it's had a really buzzy moment this year, which is surprising. I think book discourse online has had a lot to do with that, because it wasn't published this year. It's kind of a bit of a forgotten classic, and then it got a retranslation or a reprinting, I think about 5 years ago. And this year's just blown up. This is this piece of speculative fiction about a group of women who are kept in a cage by men. They have no memory of they've got no understanding of why they're being held there. And we are following one young girl who is in this group. She has no memory at all, really, of their life before they were in the cage. The other women are much older than her. And the book takes you on such a journey. There was so much psychological nuance. I think sometimes with books that have like a really out there concept like that, sometimes the people feel too familiar. Like they feel too much like a person that would exist in our world. And obviously on the one hand you want them to, because they're human beings, so you want to be able to kind of connect to them. But also on the other hand, that experience is so wildly different to my own experience that if those characters are behaving the way I think I would behave, that's not right, because they wouldn't, right? Because their life's been incredibly different. So I just thought it was really, really outstandingly good, and that is my number 10. It is holding its position. Number 9 is a classic. It is True Grit by Charles Portis, and I listened to the audiobook, which was narrated by Donna Tartt, and I read this because Ariel from Books Unbound loved it so much when she read it, and I thought, oh my God, I don't think I've read a Western. And I loved this. This is a book about a young girl who goes on a mission to avenge the death of her father in the American West. And I thought it was brilliant. I thought he wrote a young girl's voice so well. I think it is a book that has broad appeal to lots and lots of different kinds of readers who read lots and lots of different kinds of books. And I think just being able to pull that off in and of itself is really impressive. But I also I had such an enjoyable reading experience with it. I think some of the books that I included on that provisional list in June were really worthy books that were intellectually doing something really interesting. And that is not to say that the books that are on this version of that list don't do that. But I really think I've leaned a lot more into, but what did I enjoy the most? And True Grit was a thoroughly enjoyable book, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to everyone. I think it's probably the book on this list of 10 that has the most mass appeal, I think. So that is True Grit at number 9. Then at number 8, the first of the books that I read in December, I read Pet by Catherine Chidgey, which was narrated by, did I write the narrator down? Yes, I think I did. Natalie Barron. And this, oh my goodness, we've got a lot of books about young girls. There's only going to be more of them. But yeah, this is a book about a young girl who is remembering her teacher from when she was at school. And this teacher was beloved by the children, very glamorous, and they were all obsessed with wanting this teacher's affection, and she had her little pets in the class, and she would kind of change them around, and at first you think, oh, this is, I know what this is, but then more and more questions start being asked about who this woman is and why she is doing what she's doing, and things that feel maybe slightly manipulative just become more and more and more until the way this book builds, I thought, was absolutely masterful. It felt to me like a brilliant literary kind of coming of age story, perfectly matched with it's not so much a movie, but there were thriller elements of it. There were real heart in your mouth moments, real moments of being like, oh my God, what is going to happen next? And I just thought it captured that, if you were never a young girl, I don't know if you will, I don't know how familiar this feeling will be with you, but I've chatted to a lot of my friends who were once young girls and gone, do you remember that very specific, the moments that you realized how to police your body and others' bodies? And getting to a point as an adult of realizing that happened at a much earlier age than you assumed it would have. I'm not articulating myself well, but that piece of when you, as a tween, first started really going, her skin's not very good, and her thighs are a bit chubby. It's horrible, mortifying, horrid to remember thinking those things, but it's also, it deals, it's only kind of part of the book, but it captures it so well that owning the fact that you thought those things and kind of going, okay, let me sit with that for a minute, but also knowing that it's not your fault that you thought those things because you didn't think those things in a vacuum. Like, you were taught to think those things. So it's a great book. There was like a lot of narrative intrigue and a huge amount of like me exercising my like demons with it. I thought it was fantastic. Then one of the books that has stayed in the top 10 is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. This is my second Christopher Isherwood book this year? No. I read Goodbye to Berlin last year, I think. And I absolutely loved this novella. I saw the film adaptation with Colin Firth and... oh my God, who? I can't remember. Nicholas Hoult. But yeah, Tom Ford's adaptation of it, I saw years ago when it first came out, and I loved it, but I really couldn't remember that much about it except finding it really sad. I found the book really sad too, but it's 24 hours, I think. It's basically a day following one man whose partner has died recently in the 50s, I want to say, in America, and he's a college professor and his partner has died, and it navigates how difficult it is to grieve. I mean, how difficult it is to grieve anyone in any circumstances, because that's a horrible and difficult thing to deal with, but also because like not of the time in America, and his partner being a man meant that he couldn't publicly grieve. He was having to like kind of grieve very privately because only a few people in his life knew that the man who lived in the same house as him was his partner, not his roommate. And you know, like the way all of those feelings are kind of turned inward, it created this really suffocating, really difficult to read at times book about grief and grieving and trying to get through the day. And I just remember it being so affecting, and so it's really stuck with me. And my handle is Hannah Lost the Plot for a reason. Most of the books that I read are in and out of my brain within a month. Like, that's it, gone completely. And it's taken me years to become okay with the fact that happens. But this one has just really, really stuck in me. And there's some phrases and some imagery that have really stuck with me. But overall, it was just this absolute painfully explicit sort of portrayal of grief. I thought it was wonderful. Then at number 6 is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden, which was on the long list for the Booker Prize this year. So I can be grateful to the Booker Prize for... it may have contributed to my bookish burnout in September and October, but it did at least give me a favourite book of the year. So thank you very much. This is a book about our relationship with things and the meaning that we bestow to them. But it's also a mystery, a family drama. It is set in the Netherlands in the kind of post-Second World War period. We are following a woman who lives by herself, but has these 2 brothers whose lives she doesn't really want to get tangled up in, but she gets tangled up in them anyway. And her eldest brother sort of forces her to play hostess in their family home to his current squeeze. And plot happens from that point on. And I think this has got one of the most compelling first kind of opening chapters. Like, nothing kind of like really high stakes happens, but I think the very, very slow and deft reveal of what is actually going on and who are these people and what is this home that they live in, and what are these things that they cling to, and what does that mean, was just brilliant, artfully done. Also, like, really sexy at points. Some people were like digging out the like spicier scenes. I thought they were great. So, and I mean, I'm not like a smutty, spicy reader generally, but I thought there were some great scenes in here, if you're interested. So that is The Safekeep. And now we are coming to top 5. Okay. That coffee is stone cold. Number 5. Haven by Emma Donoghue. This book has taken me by surprise. It really has. It was the first Emma Donoghue book that I read, having read Room when it first came out and was an absolute sensation. This was my second Emma Donoghue book. And I think from what I have since read, and I kind of looked into her backlist, that this is much more in keeping with like what she normally writes. This is a book about 3 monks who, there is one kind of like chief monk guy in, I want to say the 12th century. That might be radically wrong. I think it is somewhere between the 11th and the 16th century. The details of this book are not what have stayed with me. This is one monk, basically, very influential, has this vision that God wants him to go and set up a haven, a hermitage on this incredibly remote island off the coast of Ireland. And he goes with one older monk and one younger monk. And the 3 of them go to this island, and then they live on this tiny, tiny island with no infrastructure, where they are absolutely fucking nowhere near anything. And they just try and live on an island. And the atmosphere in this book is the best atmosphere that I have read this year. Like, the suffocating kind of claustrophobia of living, even with all of that space and wildness and kind of like open sea around you, but knowing that your world is as big as the people that are in it, and when there's only 2 of them, that is not a very big world at all. And just loved it. But it was also a lot about faith, a huge amount about ego and ambition, and this sort of like line between wanting to perform being a good person versus being a good person. And just loved it. It also had some really, really interesting representation that I'm not going to talk about because it spoils the book. But I thought it was so brilliant. And I remember because I loved Room, by the way. Like, I thought it was a great book. But like, Room is a very particular kind of book. This is very, very, very different. It is slow, it is brooding, it is quiet. I listened to the audiobook, which was narrated, I think it was narrated by Aidan Kelly, who's narrated another book that I really enjoyed this year. Not one that's on this list though. And if you enjoy reading about people in difficult terrain, or like people in very small communities that are all in each other's business, chef's kiss. Haven by Emma Donoghue. Loved it. Then at number 4, we have The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. So it didn't retain the number 1 spot, but I still maintain it's a wonderful book. This is the year that I rediscovered how much I love Kirsten McCullers. I've read a couple of her books before. This one is my favourite of the ones that I have read so far. This is following a young girl whose brother is getting married, and she gets very, very invested in the idea of being part of her brother's wedding. And she does. It was a kind of a fortuitous slip of the tongue there. She almost like falls in love with her brother, and who's much older than her, her brother and his fiance. But the book isn't really about the wedding. The book is about her, and it takes place on 3 days, over about a week. So it takes place like just before the wedding, like 2 days just before the wedding, and then a bit just after the wedding. We don't actually see the wedding, but it's really about like girlhood and trying to understand where you fit in the world. Kirsten McCullers is really wonderful, I think, at bringing in people who sit at the edges of society. She writes incredibly sensitively and beautifully about childhood. I think it's a really authentic girl's voice. I think that about actually those 4 books, I Have Never Known Men, True Grit, Pet, and The Member of the Wedding, all do young girls' voices brilliantly, very differently, but brilliantly. And I feel like I've spoken about this book quite a lot. It was in one of my impatient reading videos early on in the year. I obviously would have spoken about it in that tier ranking video. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because I've been talking for 53 minutes and we still have to get to the top 3 books and do all of December. So, Kirsten McCullers, The Member of the Wedding. Fantastic, has stayed with me, will get reread in the future. Kirsten McCullers has become an author that I very much want to complete now. I'm like, I have to read everything that she ever wrote. So yeah, that's a great book. Then, third. And this is third really for what I was saying earlier about when I think about enjoyment, like what books have I really enjoyed reading this year? The book that stands out to me is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. I fucking loved this book. I had the best time with it. It is nuts in concept, but it's lots of things that I like. It's stories of antiquity in the ancient world with Irish humour and modern kind of sensibility. So this is following 2 friends who are out of work potters in Syracuse in like BC something or other. And their island has had an attempted invasion by oh my god, who are they? Was it the Spartans? Don't expect me to remember significant plot points, guys, like where things are set and when they're set. But there's basically this invading force, much bigger army, have tried to come and conquer their island, and they failed, and they're now keeping all of these prisoners in these quarries and letting them slowly starve to death, as one did in the olden days. So these 2 potters decide to keep themselves entertained, that they'll go and visit the visitors and find out if any of them Athenians. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're Athenians, because they wanted to know if any of the men in the prison had seen any recent plays, because they obviously, like, at that time, all of the like arts were communicated by word of mouth, right? So if you wanted to know like that hot new play that's happening over there, someone's got to tell you the play, they've got to tell you what happens in it, and they've got to tell you the lines. And so they end up putting on a production of one of these plays. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. It's quite a famous one though. It's a really famous one. So that's kind of what's happening, but it's also about warfare. It's about the arts. It's about how we communicate our lived experiences beyond cultural borders, but it's also really funny. It's really funny and it's silly, but it's got a real kind of threat and narrative tempo. It is an absolute romp, and I haven't ever read a book quite like it. I loved it so much. It's a great book. I think it deserves, it's won a lot of awards. Before I read it, it had, and since I read it, it's continued to pick up recognition, quite rightly, in my opinion. It's fantastic. It's got like, Ferdia Lennon is Irish, and it's got that Irish humour that is, it reminds me of my nana. And like, I just love it. I just loved it. So that was number 3. And number 2, also one of the most enjoyable books I've read, but for very different reasons. This is The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber. This is a historical book set in Victorian London, following a young girl called Sugar, who is a prostitute, a young prostitute. She's 19 at the start of the book, and we're following her life basically. She meets this man who becomes like obsessed with her and wants to kind of take her away from this life that she's living. But this, I said earlier, was the longest book that I read this year. This could have been twice the length and I would have been so happy. Firstly, it's told particularly at the start in this was the second Michelle Faber book that I read this year, and he's got such a sense of humor about the way that he writes, and it kind of there's a lot of direct address to the reader, as if you are literally being taken through, and it's like, well, we're going over here to follow this person now, but you'll see a lot of things that you won't notice right now, but don't worry, I'll remind you when you need to go, and I'll tell you when you need to stop following that person, and then we'll go over here and follow this other person. So you don't start with Sugar, you start with other characters, and then you realise over the course of the book who those people were that you saw at the start. But it's a book that is so detailed and rich in the way that he builds the Victorian world from the inside of the characters out, so that you understand who these people are within the context of where they're living, as opposed to feeling like, even though Sugar has some progressive ideas for a girl of her era, you understand and believe that she, a girl in the Victorian era of the upbringing and experience that she's had, you understand why she feels that way, as opposed to sometimes I feel with some historical fiction, like modern day people have been dropped into a world that they don't come from. I felt like these people were completely of their world, and that made the vibrancy of the world so much richer as well. But it's a book that's a lot about families and faith, and hugely about just the experience of women in the Victorian era, the various ways that the systems and constraints of society trap them into various lives. There's an awful lot of like there's a lot of like imagery of writing in it. Sugar is writing this like revenge novel that she is basically like it's kind of like what I imagine like 120 Days of Sodom would be like, but with female rage. So it's just this book of like this woman murdering all of these men who were trying to have sex with her. So she's writing that. Then there's a lot about this other the male kind of protagonist, his wife, and the ways that she writes herself and tries to articulate her experience. And basically it's a book where all of these women are trying to write their own stories and tell their own lives and are being absolutely thwarted at all kind of points. And yet it's just a deeply enjoyable story. And I think it's because his storytelling is so strong and the characters were so strong that I just would have followed them. I just would have followed them for days and weeks and months and years, forever. Like, I loved them so much. I was really sad when the book ended, and it took me, that was one of the books that I took the longest with, not just because it was like 860 odd pages, but because I really didn't want to leave. And there were some bits in it. That book it also made me cry on a train, which, as you may know, is automatic God tier book. If you make me cry on a train, you're going in the best books of the year. Because something happened that I was so unprepared for emotionally. And yeah, brilliant. Loved it. Very, very different to the other book of his that I read this year, The Book of Strange New Things, which was in my honorary mentions of the first half of the year, and I really enjoyed also. But this was like, I just couldn't get enough of this book. I loved it. And that brings me to the best book I read this year. And I'm sorry in advance, because it is part of a series and it's not the first book in a series. The best book I read this year was Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel, which is the second in her Thomas Cromwell trilogy. So another big historical book. Who'd thunk it, hey? So many of these books in my top 10 are historical fiction. Why do I not read more of it? Good question. So this is a perfect book. And it's going to be, so I kind of can't talk about it without talking about Wolf Hall first, which I also really loved this year, but it was a reread when I read Wolf Hall in November. And so I felt slightly differently about it. I listened to the audiobook of this, which was narrated by Ben Miles. I'm obsessed with the Ben Miles narrations of this entire trilogy. At the time that I'm recording this, I have now finished the entire trilogy. I'm probably going to do a whole video about this trilogy of books because I have more than I've got time to say in this video. But this is... So the trilogy follows the rise and fall of Thomas Cromwell, who was a blacksmith's son turned merchant turned lawyer turned close chum and advisor to Henry VIII. And he was a real key figure behind a lot of what was happening in Tudor England. He was absolutely instrumental in Henry VIII's separation from the Catholic Church, which enabled him to dissolve his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. And then he was also involved in getting rid of Anne Boleyn, and he was involved in the dissolution of the monasteries and all this stuff. So he's an incredibly important figure. And I knew who he was from like school. But the way that Hilary Mantel brought this man completely to life and imagined this whole complex world for him is outstandingly good. What I would recommend if you want to hear more about the trilogy as a starting point is watch this video that I made where I listened to the audiobook of Wolf Hall while doing some crafts projects and trying to finish off various projects, because I talk quite a lot in there about Wolf Hall. Bring Up the Bodies, the bit of the time period is from Anne being made queen to Anne being killed. And what is so amazing about these books is we know what happens. We know what happens. It's Henry VIII. We know what's going to happen to Anne Boleyn. So there's this like absolute inevitability, but the way that the book is structured, there is so much nuance. I find them really funny. There is like the humour that she bestows on the character of Thomas Cromwell, this like very wry, very sarcastic. Loved it. And this book is 14 and a half hours long, and I listened to it in 2.5 days because I couldn't stop. Like, I couldn't stop listening to it. I know I said before, it was like the opposite of The Crimson Petal and the White, because I knew I wanted to take my time with it, but I couldn't take my time. I had to listen, I had to know, even though I knew. I had to know, even though I knew. And how good do you have to be at writing to have people be desperate to find out what's going to happen, even when we know what's going to happen? Like, that is some next level fucking skill. And she's just a brilliant writer. Really rich, so much interesting structural stuff happening, so much world happening, but all through Cromwell's eyes. So again, like with Michelle Faber, there is no divorce between these people and the world that they inhabit. We know enough about the world. We know only as much about the world as we need to know in order to understand the characters and to understand the people. This is not a book where we are just being clobbered with everything that Hilary Mantel knows about Tudor England. It masterful. Fucking so good. So good. Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. That's the best book that I read this year. Let me tell you briefly, I'm not going to talk about them really, but I do have honourable mentions, because if I gave myself honourable mentions for the first half of the year, I couldn't not give myself some honourable mentions for books these are books that I read this year, in the second half of this year, that I really loved, and that if 10 was a bigger number than 10 is, would have been in my top 10. So, Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Won the Booker Prize this year. I didn't love it as much as I loved The Safekeep, but I thought it was beautifully done. I know it's been quite a divisive book. I know a lot of people really didn't like it, said it had no story, said it had no plot. I'm all right with that. I'm not going to remember the plot anyway. I'm just going to remember the vibes, and this book had immaculate vibes. Clear by Caris Davies, really similar to Haven in terms of atmosphere, feeling, vibe. It was a much shorter book. It's set in a remote Scottish island this time, and a man goes to basically try and evict this guy who is living on his own and tending the island on behalf of like the wealthy landowner, and they don't speak the same language, and they just end up having this like weird little like friendship. It's wonderful book. This is the year that I found out I really liked reading books with 2 or 3 men on an island. That apparently is a genre that I'm very interested in. So if you have any more of those, let me know in a comment down below. Enlightenment by Sarah Perry was another one on the Booker Prize long list that I really enjoyed. It's the first Sarah Perry book that I've read. It wasn't perfect by any stretch, and so I wouldn't have put it in my top 10 actually if 10 had been a bigger number than 10 is, because there were too many things that I didn't love about it, but the things that I did love about it, I loved so much. I talk about it there'll be videos on my channel where I talk about most of these books in more detail, so I'm sorry. I'm fatigued on the books now. So that, really good. I Will Crash by Rebecca Watson. I really enjoyed her debut, Little Scratch. I liked this one even more. I always recommend listening to Rebecca Watson's books on audio if you can, because she writes in this incredibly immediate stream of consciousness kind of style that I think what is so powerful for audio. But this is dealing with some difficult themes, so do check content warnings before you shove it in your ears. And yeah, this is dealing with difficult relationships between families, with loss and trauma and grief and all the things that I like. Shy by Max Porter actually almost replaced Grief is a Thing with Feathers in my top 10, but then it didn't quite make it into the top 10. I preferred Shy. This was the second Max Porter book I've ever read, and the second one I read this year. And I loved this partly because I'm doing a lot of work in my day job with kids like Shy. This is a young boy who has found himself unable to get along in mainstream education, who is finding it incredibly challenging to navigate his life and doesn't really understand how or why. It's a very immediate, very fractured, very powerful little book, and I loved it. And then The Extinction of Irina Ray by Jennifer Croft, I read in another video, which I'll try and remember to link down below. This is a book about translation. It's also a murder mystery, or maybe not a murder mystery. It's incredibly meta, it's incredibly clever. Sometimes it was too clever for me and I didn't understand what was going on, but I respected the shit out of it. So those are the honourable mentions for fiction. And then I had two non-fiction books that I just want to shout out, because I know I haven't read that much non-fiction, and of the non-fiction that I've read this year, like not a whole lot of it really blew me away, but two books have had, I think, lasting impact. The first of which is All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley, which is a memoir of Patrick's 10 years working as a security guard in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Patrick took this job in the immediate aftermath of his brother dying of cancer, and he just found that he wasn't able to go into his busy New York like journalist life anymore. He wanted a slower pace. He just wanted to be, and he had really fun memories of visiting galleries as a child, and then kind of reminded him of his brother. And the book is part memoir, part art history. So it's partly like everything he's learned about himself from taking 10 years to quietly stand in an art gallery and watch people. It's also a love letter to that profession. He talks a lot and really beautifully about what a real privilege it is to be able to watch people like that, and how unusual it is, because most people don't even notice that you're there or that you're looking at them, and that no, people not really realizing how much the people who have that job know about art, because they have been standing in these galleries for a really, really long time. And like the scale of the building, like I've been to the Met and I was overwhelmed as a visitor, and we only saw a fraction of it because I couldn't cope with like the crowds and how many things there were and how much there was to see. And this really proved to me that that wasn't my fault, because this man spent 10 years in that art gallery and he didn't have a chance to see and really take in everything, and he spent a decade there. So I feel better for getting overwhelmed in a 2-hour window. And I just thought it was lovely. Like it made me cry. It was beautiful. He's a like beautiful writer, and I really, really recommend it. And that was another one that I read. I bought that. I pre-ordered that book because I saw it online somewhere. I think I'd seen like a publisher announcement or something about it, and I thought, oh, fuck, that sounds great. That sounds really interesting. I really like books about art and music and like the arts in general. And I ordered it, and then it sat on my shelf until Ariel from Books Unbound again read it and loved it. And I thought, for fuck's sake, that book has been on my shelf. I need to read it. So thank you to Ariel for making me pick up that book. It was beautiful. And then in a very different vein, and I'm not going to talk about this book much at all, because this book is going to be highly influential in terms of next week's video. Half-Assed Human by Lena Norms. This only came out last month. I am a big fan of Lena's channel. She does a lot of bookish content, but she also creates a lot of content about the climate and about slow fashion and sustainable living. And she always has really interesting things to say, really well-researched kind of video essays. And I really enjoy her content. And this is a book about how to half-ass life and why we keep getting in our way. It's a self-help book. And I am not a person who reads a lot of self-help. Really, I kind of take literature to be my self-help a lot of the time. But this was great and genuinely flicked some switches in my brain that I was like, yes. So we'll be talking Half-Assed Human next week when we talk about reading goals. So that is the end of the wrap up of 2024. Good Lord, how are you doing? Are you okay? You're doing all right. I'm just going to give you a minute. I talk kind of loud and I talk really fast, so just take a sec, calm down. You good? Yeah, I'm okay. I think I'm ready to continue too. December wrap up. I read 14 books. I read 14 books in December. 2 of them I already told you about in my November wrap up because I got excited and forgot what dates were. So they were Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, was in last month's wrap up, even though I technically finished it in December, and Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue, another historical fiction by Emma Donoghue, which I really liked, but nowhere near as much as I loved Haven. So I'm not going to talk about those. Get those out of the way straight away. Then we have a number of books that I've already spoken to you about. So don't worry, this section shouldn't be too long, because in December I read Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. All the stars, all the plaudits. It should have won the Booker twice. The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber. Second best book of the year. Stunning. Loved it. Pet by Catherine Chidgey. Also read in December. Also loved it. Half-Assed Human by Lena Norms. Also read in December. Also loved it. All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley. Also read in December. Also loved it. Like, December. What a reading month. What a reading month. So let me talk to you about the other fiction that I read firstly. So I read Mrs. Death by Salena Godden, and I started a vlog reading. What were the books I was going to be reading? Mrs. Death was one of them. Pet was another one. And then there were a couple of others. And it was going to be my final impatient reading vlog of the year. And then, like, I got halfway through the video, and sometimes I'll just get halfway through a video and be like, nah, and just stop. I never finished making it. But this is a book that has been on my shelf for a really long time, because a lot of people whose opinion I really respect and often have similar views to had really enjoyed it. And I also just really love the title. And I picked it up, and it had one of the best openings. And I know I said that about The Safekeeper, I mean it in a very different way. Had a really interesting opening that just kind of, like, the way it was written really got me. It's the way that I sometimes feel about the opening of an Ali Smith book. I was like, okay. And it is a book that is about It's narrated by a character called Wolf. And Wolf starts seeing Mrs. Death. Mrs. Death is death, a physical manifestation of death. She is an old black woman who most people don't even notice. She's out there in the world, she's wandering around, but we've been conditioned to look for the Grim Reaper, and so we don't even notice her, we don't see her. But Wolf does, and Wolf is aiming to tell the story of Death's life. You with me? And I thought the content was so cool, and some of the writing I really enjoyed, particularly early on in the book. But unfortunately, I ended up not really liking it. And I still can't quite put my finger on why. I think it's because partly there was a twist. I think it was a twist. But even the fact that I'm not sure if it was a twist is maybe telling you something that I had seen coming like a mile off. And then thought there was a moment where it felt like it was getting revealed. And I was like, well, yes, of course. You know, you have one of those moments where you're like, is this a reveal? Was I not supposed to already know that this was happening? And so I had a little bit of that, and I found it a little bit like Salena Godden is a poet also. And I actually didn't really, there are poems in the book, and I didn't really love the poetry in it. And some of the sections of writing felt a little like surplus to requirement for like the story. I'm sad about it because I was so excited when I started reading it. I thought I was going to absolutely love it. And unfortunately just ended up feeling like a little bit middling about it, which was sad really. But I think, like really cool ideas. I didn't love the execution of it. So that was Mrs. Death. A book that I really did enjoy though is Disobedience by Naomi Alderman. This is another one that I was going to read in the Impatient Reading blog. And I haven't read any Naomi Alderman before. The only other book of hers that I was really aware of was The Power, which is that one where like women wake up one day with like the ability to like electrocute men, which I was kind of always interested in, but a bit like, I don't know if that's going to be for me. And Disobedience, all I knew about this is that there was a film adaptation with Rachel Weisz and Rachel McAdams, is it? And all I knew about that was that it was two Jewish women, and from the trailer and the marketing alone of the film, I knew that there was a sapphic affair, seemed very illicit, very sexy. And I wasn't sure off the basis of that if I was gonna love this, because the film seemed a little sensationalized and a little fetishized. I haven't seen the film, so I could be wrong. It could just be like marketing and trailers and stuff making it look that way. And I was so pleasantly surprised by how much this book wasn't really about that at all. It is about two Jewish women who did have a relationship, had an affair. Well, was it even an affair? They basically, when they were young girls, when they were teenagers, they had like a sexual relationship and I guess a romantic relationship, but maybe more of a sexual relationship. And one of them has been living in New York and has completely left their very orthodox, from a very orthodox Jewish community. And her father, what's her name? Oh my God, I can't remember her name. The Rachel Weisz character has been living in New York, is not excommunicated from the community, but very removed from the community. And she comes back to London because her father, who was like the head of their little temple, like not just a rabbi, like more important than a rabbi, like the community glue guy, has died. And so she comes back for the funeral and doesn't expect to see this woman there, but she has in fact, the woman who was the girl that she knew when she was younger is now married to her cousin. And so there are sapphic things happening in the book, but it is so much more about trying to understand and make sense of your identity more broadly than that. It's a lot about Ronit, that's her name, trying to work out her own relationship with being Jewish, because she's like, you can't, like, even if I walk away from this community and I never see these people again, it's not going to make me not Jewish anymore. So like, what do I do with that? And also about just trying to find a way of being at peace with yourself, not just in terms of your sexual identity, but like much more holistically than that. So I'm really interested in the film now, and I'm going to watch it at some point, because it gives a very different impression of the book than the book that I read. And my words have been spoken for far too long, I think. But either way, I really liked it. I was surprised by how much I liked it. Not a favourite book, but I enjoyed it. Great. And then the last fiction, not quite the last fiction actually, I read Normal Rules Don't Apply by Kate Atkinson. I listened to the audiobook of this, which was narrated brilliantly by Patterson Joseph. This I read a little bit by accident, but did end up taking me by surprise, because I got this out of the library, and you know, sometimes you don't see, when it's an audiobook, sometimes they have the proper audiobook cover and sometimes they just have a square version of the main cover. And when I got it from Borrow Box, I saw at the bottom it said short stories, and I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, because I don't do well with short stories, all right? However, maybe I do, but maybe I don't. We'll see. I really enjoyed this mostly. This is a series of short stories that are some of them are slightly connected and some are very connected, with like the same characters reappearing. And the first story opens with this event, this like global event that happens, where like it goes dark for like a couple of minutes, and when the light comes back on, anyone who was outside at the time that happened is dead. And it keeps coming back, but they slowly kind of learn to like time it and stuff. And that's the first story, is just that happening. And you're like, whoa, weird. And then there's lots of stories in between that are less speculative in that vein, but sort of linked. And I was really enjoying it. I was like, oh my God, am I gonna like short stories? And I did like a lot of the short stories. I really enjoy Kate Atkinson's writing about families and people. I think she does those dynamics really well. But this short story collection did the same thing that Life After Life by Kate Atkinson did to me, which is like, I loved it until the final 10%, and then it just lost me. And I was like, oh. Like, I really wanted to go with you, but I just can't bring myself to go there with you. And actually, slightly differently to that, I am 85% sure I don't understand what happened at the end of this book. I think I needed to, I think I ended up listening, it was due back and I couldn't renew it anymore. And so I listened to like the last bit, so it's probably not the book's fault entirely. I listened to the last bit like in a slightly more intensive way than I probably should have. And I was also like knitting quite late at night when I listened to the end, and I probably like needed to like really listen to it. So if you have read this short story collection and you understand the ending, could you let me know in a comment in a way that makes it abundantly clear to our fellow travellers on the internet that you're about to spoil the book, explain it to me. Because it's now got a really long waiting list for me to get it back out of the library, and by the time it comes back I will have forgotten all the other stories, and I don't really know if I can listen to it again. But I was really enjoying so much of it, and then I just didn't get it, lads. I just didn't get it. So I mostly liked it, I guess. Then I listened to 2 audiobooks in the run up to Christmas to get me in the festive mood. We host Christmas. My partner and I have his family come to us, and my brother, who has recently moved up here as well, all came over. And my partner was in a panto this year, which meant that he was working his fucking socks off all festive season, which meant I was doing all of the Christmas prep. I mean, I would normally be doing all of the Christmas cooking because the cooking in the house is my baby. But there was a lot to do. And I was like, I just want gentle audiobooks or festive vibe audiobooks that I can just listen to while I'm doing all of the veg prep, making everything, standing in my kitchen, da da da. So I listened to 2 books that were excellent for this, if you want to make a note for next year. The first one, unfortunately, does require an Audible subscription because it is an Audible exclusive. But I don't know how it works. If you've just got an account and you don't have an active subscription, you're not currently paying or giving them anything, I think you can listen to it still. It was The Secret History of Christmas by Bill Bryson. Farmer put me onto this, my best friend Farmer. She said that she listens to this every year on her drive. It's only about 3 hours. And for her to drive from Newcastle to where her family live in the Northwest is about a 3-hour drive. So she listens to it on her drive home every year. Because she's an adorable creature of habit. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is Bill Bryson in classic Bill Bryson style, doing some deep dive, gentle history of a number of the traditions that we have. So about Christmas trees, about Christmas carols, about where our various little festive traditions, particularly festive traditions that we have in the UK, where they come from, and sometimes the surprising places that those traditions come from. Obviously, I can't remember a single thing, but I enjoyed it at the time. Then I listened to Hercule, Poirot's Christmas by Agatha Christie, which was read by Hugh Fraser. I think this is the first Agatha Christie book I've ever read, you know. I really think it is. Unless I might have read one when I was a teenager, but I can't remember. But I was thinking about how I do enjoy watching the recent films, the Kenneth Branagh as Poirot films around this time, and I was like, there must be an Agatha Christie book I could listen to. Maybe I wanted something that was quite plotty, preferably a bit historical. So this was perfect. It wasn't a brilliant murder mystery. I think the general consensus is it's not one of Christie's best, but it happens in and around Christmas. It is a locked room murder that happens when a family are all descending on their father's house. He gets killed. A lot of them were estranged. They've all got weird relationships. They're all privileged and awful. What's not to love? It was great. I enjoyed it. It's on Everand if you have a subscription. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it for now, but if you just stick a pin in it and remember it for next year, then, I recommend it for Christmas 2025. Then finally, very quickly, because I don't have much to say about them, 2 non-fiction books. I read Mask Off, Masculinity Redefined by JJ Bola. This I'm not going to talk about really at all because I read it for work, for a project that I'm doing. So, but it was an interesting book about masculinity. I've been reading a lot in that area, I didn't find too much in it that was like new to me. But I think if you are interested in particularly like intersectional identities in the kind of masculine space, then it was all right. It was all right. I got what I needed out of it for work. It was fine. Then I listened to an essay collection called Body Horror by Anne Elizabeth Moore. And I helpfully didn't write the subtitle down, but it was something like capitalism, fear, something, and jokes. And this was such a mixed bag, because there were some essays that I found so interesting. Like, she does some essays that are like deep dives into, so what is she going to be able to think of a single example? She did one that was like, was it about toilet paper? It was something like that. I don't think it was toilet paper, but it was something like toilet paper. And she goes into like the like capitalist machinery behind it, and like how it all comes back to like the patriarchy. And that was so interesting. She also had another one about like how the patriarchal manifestations of patent law, which sounds really specific, but I actually found that the specific essays really interesting. But then she had some that had a much broader focus that I just felt a little bit like, I felt they were a little bit like ranty and a little bit like over laboured. And I just didn't think, from what I could tell from the foreword, these weren't essays that were written to be a collection. They were kind of gathered from a few other places. And the main thing that annoyed me about it was I really didn't think there was anything in it about jokes at all. Like, I think she thinks there were, but I didn't think there were. So there were some interesting ideas. There were some interesting essays about chronic pain and about the healthcare system, but obviously she's American, so skewed massively towards like how their system is set up, although ours is not going to be a million miles away from it in a few generations. But yeah, I'm not going to go out of my way to recommend it, but if you think if you're really interested in patent law, that was just one essay. The rest of them were not all about that, but there was some stuff about horror films, but again, like not much. I realized quite late on in the year that I really like essay collections, and I hadn't listened to any, and I think I was just going through everyone looking for essay collections that were available to listen to now, and I clicked on this one. It was a bit of a shot in the dark, and it didn't 100% work for me, but never mind, hey ho. So there you have it. That is 2024 in a nutshell, plus the books that I read in December. You must tell me your best books of the year, please. Tell me your favourite things. Have you noticed any trends in your reading? Like me, did you kind of look at your best list and go, oh, hang on, there's some themes here. Like, I've got big chunky historical novels and books about girls. Like, no big surprise, but like I was surprised at how many of those were on my list. So tell me your best books. I will see you next week probably for a review of goals and a chat about what I'm planning on doing with my reading and my life and this channel in 2025. And until then, I hope 2025 has been gentle to you so far. I hope you are not putting unnecessarily high expectations on yourself. We are fundamentally the same people we were last year. Let's remember and embrace that fact. and I will see you for another video soon. Over and out.